The day Mary Merritt buried her husband was the same day she decided she would not let the land bury her. The Kansas sun hung low and merciless over the Merritt Ranch in the autumn of 1882, burning the dry grass gold and casting long shadows across the modest headstone she had pressed into the earth herself, because the hired hand had already packed his things and ridden off before the funeral was even done. Thomas Merritt had been a good man, a steady man, and he had left behind 40 acres of hard-won land, a herd of 62 cattle, 2 horses, a mule named Chester, and a wife who had learned long ago that grief was a luxury she could not afford for long. Mary stood over the grave with her hands folded and her jaw set and her dark eyes dry, not because she did not love Thomas, she had loved him fiercely, but because there were cattle that needed water and a fence along the northern pasture that had been threatening to give out for 3 weeks, and the world did not pause for widows. She was 28 years old. She had been on this land since she was 19. She knew every inch of it, every temperamental water pump and every loose post and every shortcut through the cottonwood grove by the creek. She had helped Thomas build the barn with her own hands. She had ridden alongside him in blizzards and droughts, and she had held the difficult calvings, and she had stood on the porch with a rifle when a pair of horse thieves had come sniffing around 3 years back. Mary Merritt was not a woman who waited to be rescued. She turned away from the grave, squared her shoulders, and went back to work. The first 2 weeks after Thomas died were the hardest she had ever known, and she had known some very hard weeks. The fence along the northern pasture did give out on the 5th day, and she spent 14 hours in the cold mending it, coming back into the house with cracked and bleeding hands. She lost 3 cattle to a sickness she could not fully identify before a neighbor, old Elias Bunt from the farm 6 miles east, rode over and looked at the animals and confirmed it was an infection spreading through the water trough, and she drained it and scrubbed it and lost no more. She kept the accounts at night by lantern light, adding and subtracting in careful columns, watching the numbers narrow. Thomas had not been a poor manager, but the ranch operated on tight margins, and without a hired hand, she was burning through her own energy faster than she could sustain. She told herself she could handle it. She believed it, too. She was not wrong about her own capability, and that was the truth of it. The question was never whether Mary Merritt could survive alone. The question was whether surviving alone was the only way things had to be. Robert Redmond arrived in Colby, Kansas, on a Thursday morning in late October of 1882, aboard the westbound Santa Fe line with nothing but a saddle roll, a pair of worn leather saddlebags, and a reputation as the finest working cowboy in 3 counties who had never once held a deed to his own name. He was 32 years old and built like a man who had spent every one of those years outdoors, broad through the shoulders, lean through the middle, with hands that were rough and capable, and a face that had been tanned so deeply by the sun it seemed made of the land itself. He had dark auburn hair under a battered brown hat, and eyes the color of good river water, that shifting green-gray that changed depending on what was behind him. He had come from Colorado, where he had spent 4 years as foreman on the Hargrove Spread, a large and profitable cattle operation that had recently sold to a railroad company that had no use for a foreman. The Hargrove patriarch, old Gerald Hargrove himself, had pressed a letter of reference into Robert's hand and told him he was the best working man he had ever employed and he was sorry, and Robert had tipped his hat and ridden to the train station without making a scene because that was his way. He had heard about opportunities in western Kansas. There was a man in Colby named Dunbar who was supposedly hiring experienced ranch hands for a new operation he was building out near the Smoky Hill River. Robert stepped off the train, retrieved his horse from the stock car, a steady buckskin mare he called me, and rode toward Colby's Main Street in search of the land office where Dunbar was reportedly doing business. He found Dunbar. He also found that Dunbar's offer was half the wage he had been told and involved conditions he found disagreeable, specifically the treatment of the Mexican and Negro workers Dunbar kept on his crew, men who were paid a fraction of what the white hands made and housed in conditions Robert had seen applied to livestock. He spent 10 minutes in Dunbar's office and walked out without shaking the man's hand. He stood in the street afterward with his hat in his hands, looking up and down the length of Colby's main road. There was a general store, a post office, a feed merchant, a saloon that looked loud even at this hour, a small church, and a woman struggling with a wagon wheel at the far end of the street who appeared to need nobody's help, based on the way she was already crouching down and examining the axle with complete self-assurance. Robert watched her for a moment. Then he watched her stand up, press her fists to her hips, look at the sky with an expression that mixed determination with genuine exhaustion, and then crouch back down and begin trying to lift the wheel into alignment by herself, which was technically possible but deeply difficult without a second pair of hands to hold the axle steady. He walked over, not running, because the woman did not appear to be in danger, only in an inconvenient situation. He stopped a respectful distance away and said, "That axle will need someone holding the pin while you lift. I could help if you are willing." She looked up at him. He noticed that she did not look at him with alarm or gratitude or the particular fluttery helplessness he had encountered in some women when a man offered assistance. She looked at him the way a person looks at a tool that might be useful, assessing and direct. "You know about wagon axles," she said. "Enough," he said. She considered this for precisely 2 seconds. "Then get down here," she said, and handed him a short iron pin she had already extracted from her coat pocket, which told him she had understood the problem clearly enough on her own and had simply been lacking the extra hands. They fixed the wheel in 6 minutes. It was workmanlike and efficient, and when it was done, Mary stood up and dusted her hands on her coat and said, "Thank you, I am Mary Merritt. My ranch is about 8 miles southwest of here." "Robert Redmond," he said, and shook her hand, which she offered immediately and without any of the hesitation some women added to that gesture. "Just arrived in Colby this morning. Looking for work." "I was," he said. "The position I came for turned out to be something different from what I was told." "Dunbar," she said, reading something in his expression. "Yes, he does that," she said, and something in her voice told him she had seen the result of Dunbar's practices before. "He is not a good man." "No," Robert agreed simply. "He is not." There was a brief silence in which the street noise of Colby, the creak of wagon wheels, the distant voices from the saloon, the wind coming off the plains filled the space between them. Mary was looking at him with that same direct assessment, and he stood still under it without fidgeting, because he had nothing to hide and he had learned that a woman who looked at you like that was measuring something real. "I need a hand at the Merritt Ranch," she said. "My husband died 3 weeks ago. I have 40 acres, 62 head of cattle, 2 horses, and a mule who is deeply uncooperative. The work is hard and the pay is honest. It is not a large operation, so the wage reflects that, but you will have room in the bunkhouse and meals and fair treatment. I will not ask you to do anything I would not do myself." He looked at her for a moment. The wind moved the brim of her hat slightly and she reached up and pressed it back down without breaking eye contact. "I would be grateful for the work," he said. She nodded, as though that settled it, and climbed back onto the wagon seat. "I need to finish my errands at the feed merchant. I will be ready to head back in about an hour. You can stable your horse at the livery and settle with the livery man. I will cover the fee." "That is not necessary," he said. "You just fixed my wagon wheel," she said. "It is necessary." She clicked to her horse, and the wagon moved forward, and Robert stood in the dust of the street and watched it go, and he felt something in his chest that he could not quite name, something that was not romantic yet, not quite, but was the first stir of a feeling that would grow like a slow-burning fire into something he had never expected to find on the high plains of Kansas in his 32nd year. The bunkhouse at the Merritt Ranch was small and clean, and showed the care of a woman who did not believe that a space being functional meant it had to be without dignity. There was a narrow bed with a good blanket, a wash basin, a small stove, and a hook on the wall for clothes. Robert unpacked his saddlebags and hung his spare shirt and studied the room with the eye of a man who had slept in many kinds of places and appreciated this one genuinely. He met the mule Chester that first evening and understood immediately what Mary had meant. Chester was a large, gray, exquisitely stubborn animal who communicated his opinions about the world through strategic refusals to move and the occasional well-timed sideways lean into whoever was trying to lead him. Robert spent 20 minutes making Chester's acquaintance with great patience and several pieces of dried apple from his bag, and by the end of it Chester was still not convinced, but was at least willing to be led to the water trough. Mary watched this from across the yard without comment, but he caught a brief softening at the corner of her mouth that he thought, in other circumstances, might have become a smile. Dinner that first night was beef stew with cornbread and strong coffee, eaten at the kitchen table in the main house. Mary sat across from him and they talked practically about the ranch, the state of the cattle, which pastures were in need of attention, the water situation, the condition of the tack. She answered his questions directly and asked her own with equal directness, wanting to know about his experience with cattle sickness, his ability to shoe a horse, his comfort with a rifle in case of predators, his opinion on winter feed preparation. He answered everything honestly, including the things he was less experienced with, because he had learned that employers who were worth working for respected honesty about limitations more than false confidence. She refilled his coffee without asking if he wanted more, which he did, and he said thank you, and she said it was no trouble, and neither of them said anything that was not practical for the entire meal. But there was a quality to the silence between practical sentences that was not uncomfortable, and Robert noticed it the way you notice the temperature of a room, something he filed away without examining closely. The first month was work, pure and relentless and clarifying. November in western Kansas came in hard that year, with early frost and wind that stripped the color from the plains and left everything stark and bone pale. Robert and Mary fell into a rhythm that had the quality of something organic, not arranged, but simply arrived at through practice. He took the early morning chores, the cattle check and the feeding and the water troughs, while she managed the accounts and the house and the supply coordination, and by mid-morning they were working alongside each other on whatever the day required, and the work had a quality of genuine partnership that Robert had rarely felt in his years of employment. He was careful with her. He understood, in the way that thoughtful men understand these things, that she was in a period of adjustment that had nothing to do with capability and everything to do with grief, and that the last thing she needed was a man who treated her like she was fragile. So he did not treat her like she was fragile. He treated her like the competent rancher she was, which she noticed, and which mattered to her more than she said for a long while. But he also noticed when she was tired. He noticed when the ledger columns were troubling her, when she came to the table in the morning with the particular set to her jaw that meant she had been awake in the night running numbers that did not quite add up. He noticed when she had been mending fencing in the cold for too long and her hands were stiff, and he would take over the heavier sections without making a production of it, simply moving alongside her and picking up the work. She noticed him noticing. She did not say anything about it for a long time. They had their first real conversation about something other than the ranch about 6 weeks in. It was a Sunday, one of those Kansas winter Sundays where the sky was enormous and perfectly still, and the cold was dry rather than bitter, and the cattle were settled and the chores were done before noon. Mary had brought coffee out to the porch and handed him a mug without ceremony, and they stood looking out at the flat expanse of land together. "Where did you come from before Colorado?" she asked. "Missouri, originally," he said. "Farm country, my family had land there. Had. My father lost it. The bank mostly, a bad series of harvests and then a loan that grew faster than the land could pay for." He said it without self-pity, which she appreciated. I was 18. I went west because there was nothing to hold me east. No family, a sister in St. Louis, she married a merchant, we write." He paused. "And you said you have been on this land since you were 19. Where were you before?" "Ohio," she said. "My father was a minister. I was the third of 5 children." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "Thomas was from Kansas. He came east to visit a cousin, and we met at a church social, and he wrote me letters for a year before he asked my father for permission to court me properly. He was a very determined letter writer." Something in her voice shifted on that sentence, not breaking but deepening, the way a color deepens in water. "He brought me out here in the spring of 1873. I thought I would hate it. I loved it immediately." "The land," Robert said. "It was not quite a question. The size of it," she said. "In Ohio everything felt very contained, very arranged. Here everything is just open." She looked out at the plains. "I used to stand on this porch in the mornings and feel like I could see all the way to the edge of the world." "You still can," he said. She glanced at him sideways, and he was looking out at the horizon, and she looked back at the horizon too, and neither of them said anything else for a while, but it was the best kind of silence, the kind that holds something warm at its center. December arrived, and with it a crisis that would have tested a more established operation. 3 days before Christmas, a wildfire started on the Lassiter property to the west, old Ned Lassiter's land, which had been empty since Lassiter moved to Wichita 2 years ago, and let the dry grass on his abandoned acres grow unchecked and tall. The fire was sparked by a careless railroad worker on the line that ran along the property's southern edge, and it moved east with the wind before anyone realized what was happening. Mary saw the smoke from the north pasture, where she was checking on a heifer who had been off her feed. The sky turned orange-gray in a way that meant business, and she was running back toward the house before the smell of smoke properly reached her. Robert was already coming out of the barn at a dead run, having seen it from the loft window. They moved together without stopping to discuss it, because there was no time for discussion. Robert hitched Chester to the plow. Chester expressed his strong objection, but yielded to urgency, and cut fire breaks along the western fence line, while Mary rode the perimeter and drove the cattle east toward the creek, which was their natural protection. 2 of the cattle panicked and bolted north, away from the creek and toward the smoke, and Mary rode after them with a combination of skill and desperation that left Robert watching for one split second with something close to awe before he turned back to the plow. The fire did not reach the barn. It took the western fence entirely, 3 acres of dry grass, and a stand of old cottonwoods along the property line. But the fire breaks held, and the creek held, and by nightfall the wind shifted, and the fire turned and burned itself out against a section of bare pasture to the north. Mary and Robert stood at the western fence line in the dark with the smell of smoke still thick in the air and looked at the damage. "The fence can be rebuilt," Robert said. "I know," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands, he noticed, were shaking slightly, not from fear but from the release of hours of sustained tension, the body's natural unwinding. Without thinking about it much, which was perhaps the most honest thing he ever did, he reached out and put his hand over hers where it rested on the fence post. It was a brief contact, warm and sure, and he felt her hand still under his, and he let go after a moment, looking away, as though he had not quite meant to do it. She did not say anything, but the shaking in her hand stopped. They rebuilt the western fence together over the following 2 weeks, working in the short December days until the light failed. It was hard labor and repetitive, and they talked through most of it, not always about important things, sometimes just the steady running conversation of 2 people who have grown comfortable together. He told her about the ranches he had worked, about a particular roundup in Colorado that had gone wrong in spectacular fashion, involving a river crossing and a very determined bull. And she laughed, really laughed, a full and unguarded sound that he had not heard from her before, and that hit him somewhere in the chest like a bell being struck. She told him about the early years with Thomas, about learning to cook on a wood stove in a kitchen that was just a lean-to attached to the original soddy before the house was properly built, about the summer they had to track a missing horse for 3 days through the heat, only to find him peacefully grazing in a neighbor's apple orchard 6 miles away, perfectly happy and extremely fat. He laughed at that, and she said it had not been funny at the time, and he said no, but it was funny now, and she agreed it was very funny now. Christmas Day, they had a simple dinner together at the kitchen table, and she had made a dried apple pie with a crust that was exceptional, and he told her so with complete sincerity, and she said thank you in a way that suggested she was genuinely pleased rather than merely polite. After dinner, he gave her a gift, which he had been nervous in a way that was not entirely about the propriety of it, but about something more personal. It was a small thing, a leather-covered journal he had found in Colby's general store on his last supply trip, because he had noticed she kept notes in a worn and splitting notebook, and the thought of her needing something to write in and not having it bothered him in a way that he could not quite explain. She held the journal and looked at it for a moment and then looked at him and said, "You noticed my notebook. It was coming apart at the spine," he said. She pressed her hand flat against the cover of the new journal and said, "Robert," just his name, in a voice that meant more than his name. He had gotten her something. She gave him something too. She had clearly planned it, which meant she had been thinking about him in the days before Christmas in a way that was separate from the work. It was a pair of good leather gloves, well made and properly sized, and he looked at the sizing and said, "How did you know?" "I looked at your old ones," she said simply. He put the gloves on and they fit perfectly, and he said they were the best gloves he had ever owned, which was the truth. And she said good, because his old ones were shameful, and the warmth in her voice when she said it made shameful sound very much like "I have been paying attention to you." January 1883 came in with a blizzard that lasted 4 days, and kept them both indoors for much of it, which created a new kind of closeness that the outdoor work had not. They were in the house together during the worst of it, and they played cards and she read aloud from the 2 books she owned, a Bible and a copy of David Copperfield that had made the journey from Ohio with her. And he had not heard Dickens read aloud before, and found that he liked it very much, particularly the way she read, with different voices for different characters that she seemed mildly embarrassed about when he laughed appreciatively. He fixed the kitchen chair that had been wobbling for weeks and rehung the cellar door that swung wrong, and she said she had been meaning to ask someone to do both of those things for months, and he said he would have done them sooner if he had known, and she said she did not like asking for help with things she could theoretically do herself, and he said he understood that, and he did, genuinely. "Do you not get lonely?" she asked him on the 3rd day of the blizzard. They were sitting by the fire after supper, the wind making the window glass flecks in its frame, the lamp burning low and steady. "I have been lonely," he said, "on some of the ranches. The work is so consuming you forget there are other kinds of life." He looked at the fire. "Less lately." She was quiet for a moment. "Less lately," she repeated, not a question. "This is the first place in some years where the evenings feel like something worth being present for," he said, and he meant it carefully with consideration, not as a declaration of feeling but as an honest observation, and she received it the same way, carefully, with consideration. "I am glad," she said. And then softly, "I am glad you are here, Robert." He looked at her then, and she was looking at the fire, and the light caught the line of her jaw and the curve of her mouth, and he thought, with the absolute clarity of a man who has finally understood something he should have understood weeks ago, that he was in serious danger of falling in love with Mary Merritt. He said nothing about this. It was not the moment, and she was still a woman 10 weeks out of grief, and he was a man who had been employed in her home, and some things required patience and the right moment and a great deal of careful thought. He tended the fire and said good night when she rose to go to bed, and listened to the blizzard shake the house, and lay awake in the bunkhouse thinking about the way she said his name. Spring came to western Kansas the way it always did, tentatively at first, then all at once, like someone had turned a key. The grass came back green and insistent, and the creek ran high with snowmelt, and the cattle grew restless with the energy of warmer air. Mary and Robert moved the herd to the spring pastures and spent long days on horseback, and the work expanded with the season, and something between them was expanding too, slowly, and with the particular deliberateness of two people who were both aware of it and both being careful. He had been at the Merritt ranch for 5 months by the time the first real complication arrived. His name was Harlan Voss, and he came on a Tuesday in March with 2 riders behind him and a demeanor that suggested he owned things other people were currently occupying. He was a land speculator, which in western Kansas in 1883 was a profession that wore many faces, and none of them were friendly. He had been buying up land in the county through a combination of financial pressure and legal maneuvering, sometimes acquiring properties from widows and struggling families at prices well below their actual value, by arriving when people were most vulnerable. Mary was in the yard when Voss rode in, and Robert was at the barn and came out when he heard the horses, and stood slightly back and to the left with his hat in his hands and his eyes moving between Voss and the 2 riders, who had the look of men employed to be present rather than to work. Voss tipped his hat to Mary with a smile that did not reach any of the features above his mouth. He was a heavy man, well dressed for the plains, with the soft hands of someone who signed papers rather than pulled fence posts. "Mrs. Merritt," he said, "I heard about your loss. I am deeply sorry for your trouble." "Thank you," Mary said, in a tone that was courteous and gave nothing away. "I came to speak with you about a matter that might be of benefit to you in your current circumstances," Voss said. "I represent a group of investors who are acquiring agricultural land in this county, and the Merritt property is exactly the kind of acreage we have interest in. I believe we could offer you a fair price, something that would allow you to relocate somewhere more comfortable for a woman in your situation." Mary looked at him steadily. "And what situation is that?" Voss spread his hands with an expression of practiced sympathy. "Alone, Mrs. Merritt, managing this kind of operation alone. It is a great deal for any person to carry." "I am not alone," Mary said, "and I am not interested in selling." Voss's eyes moved briefly to Robert, who held his gaze without expression. Voss looked back at Mary. "Perhaps you might think on it. The price we are prepared to offer would not remain available indefinitely, and I have heard the northern fence suffered significant fire damage last winter. Operations in recovery can be fragile." Robert took one deliberate step forward. He did not say anything threatening. He did not need to. He simply moved into the conversation with his full presence, which was considerable, and looked at Voss with the calm directness of a man who had absolute clarity about where he stood. "Mrs. Merritt has given you her answer," Robert said. "I think you had best ride on." There was a moment. Voss looked at Robert. The 2 riders looked at each other. Voss smiled a different kind of smile, smaller and colder. "Of course," he said. "Good day to you both." He turned and rode out, and the 2 riders went with him, and Mary watched them go until they were small on the road, and then she let out a long, slow breath. "He will come back," Robert said quietly. "I know," she said. "Men like that always do." She turned and went back into the house, and Robert stood in the yard watching the dust settle, feeling the particular combination of protectiveness and anger that Voss had stirred in him. Not just anger on behalf of Mary, but a more specific fury at the way Voss had looked at the land as though it were already his, and at Mary as though she were an inconvenience to be managed rather than a person to be respected. He spent that evening at the kitchen table with her, going over the accounts, looking at every number with fresh eyes, because Voss's comment about fragile operations had been calculated, and Robert wanted to know exactly what they were working with. The picture was honest tight but not desperate. The cattle were in good condition. Spring calving was going well, 3 new calves already in 2 weeks. The prices in Wichita were holding. If the summer was fair and the fall cattle sale was strong, the ranch would be comfortable. "He does not have any legal claim to pressure you with?" Robert asked. "None," she said. "The land is clear. Thomas paid the last of the bank note 4 years ago. I have the deed in the strongbox." "Good." He closed the ledger. "Then he is only noise." "Expensive noise if he starts influencing buyers at the fall sale," she said, and he could see she had thought through all of it carefully, had been thinking through it since the moment Voss rode in, had assessed it from every angle with the precision of a woman who had learned that her best protection was her own intelligence. "I can ride to Colby tomorrow and speak with Sheriff Alderman," Robert said. "Put him on notice that Voss has been here. It is useful to have that on record." She considered this. "Yes," she said, "that is a good idea, thank you." "I will go first thing," he said. He rose to leave and she said, "Robert," and he turned. She was looking at him with something in her face that was not quite the practical directness she usually wore, something softer and more exposed, a glimpse behind the capable exterior to the woman underneath who was carrying a very great deal. "I am grateful," she said, "not just for today, for all of it. I want you to know that." He held her gaze for a beat longer than was strictly necessary. "I know," he said. "I am grateful too." He rode to Colby the next morning and spoke to Sheriff Alderman, who was a decent man and noted Voss's visit in his record book, and said he had heard of Voss's activities in 2 neighboring counties and would keep an eye on things. Robert also stopped at the land office and spent an hour with the land agent reviewing the property records, confirming everything was in order, because he believed in being thorough. He was coming out of the land office when he ran into an old acquaintance, a cowboy named Pete Garfield who had worked with him briefly on a Wyoming drive 3 years back. Pete was passing through Colby and they had a brief coffee at the small establishment next to the post office, and Pete asked Robert what he was doing in Kansas, and Robert said he was working a ranch southwest of Colby, and Pete raised his eyebrows and said, "Settled work. Robert Redmond with settled work." And Robert said yes, and Pete looked at him for a moment and said, "Must be something worth settling for." And Robert looked out the window at the main street and said, "Yes, I believe there is." He rode back to the ranch in the afternoon light with the particular kind of quietness that comes from having said a true thing. April arrived, and with it the full swing of calving season, which was the closest thing the cattle operation had to its most demanding and also most rewarding period. Mary and Robert took turns checking on the expectant cows through the nights when the weather was uncertain, and there were 3 difficult calvings in 2 weeks that required direct intervention and long hours, and the kind of closeness that comes from working through something hard together in the dark. The 3rd difficult calving was the one that Robert would remember longest. It was a stormy night, heavy rain and lightning moving across the plains from the west, and the cow in difficulty was a large Hereford they called Mabel, who was among Mary's favorites, a steady and gentle animal who had produced well for 4 years. The calf was positioned wrong, and Mary spent 40 minutes carefully working to correct it, while Robert held the lantern and spoke quietly to Mabel and kept her calm, because he had a gift with animals that came from the kind of patience that cannot be faked. The calf came into the world at 2 in the morning in a rush of relief, and rain drumming on the barn roof, and Mary sat back on her heels in the straw and said something under her breath that might have been a prayer or might have been a profanity, and the calf shook his head and Mary laughed, the exhausted, grateful laugh of someone who has come through the other side of something. Robert knelt beside her and they watched Mabel nose her calf into standing, and the lantern light made everything gold and warm, and Mary's hair had come out of its pins, and there was a streak of mud on her cheek, and he was looking at her when she turned to look at him, and their faces were closer than they usually allowed themselves to be, in the particular intimacy of the small barn in the middle of the night. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Mary said, "He is a good one," about the calf, and Robert said, "Yes, he is." And they both stood up and the moment passed, but it passed slowly and left something behind. They walked back to the house through the rain, which had lightened to a steady mist, and she made coffee because neither of them was going to sleep right away. And they sat at the kitchen table at 2:30 in the morning drinking coffee and talking about the calf, and then about other things, and then about nothing in particular. And at some point, Robert said something that made her laugh, and she put her hand on his arm without thinking about it. Briefly, the way you touch someone you are entirely comfortable with. And then removed it and wrapped both hands back around her mug. He looked at her. She was looking at her coffee. "Mary," he said. His voice was careful and honest. It was the voice of a man who has decided something. She looked up. "I want to say something to you," he said, "and I want you to know that however you receive it, nothing between us has to change. The work is good and this is a good place, and I am not saying this to make anything complicated." She was very still. "I think about you," he said, "in a way that is more than an employer, more than a friend even." He put his mug down and looked at her directly. "I have not said anything because the timing felt wrong. You were grieving and I was employed here, and both of those things seemed like reasons for silence. But I think you should know, because I think you are a person who deserves honesty." The rain touched the window glass with small, steady sounds. Mary looked at him for a long time. There was something moving across her face that he watched without trying to read too precisely, something complex and honest, and arrived at through real consideration. "Thomas has been gone for 6 months, she said slowly. "I have spent those months telling myself that what I needed was to be capable and self-sufficient and not to need anything from anyone." She paused. "Which I am, capable. I want you to know I know that." "I know you know that," he said, "and you are right. You are absolutely capable." "But," she said, and something about the word was very quiet and very significant. "But you should not have to do everything alone if you do not want to," he said. "That is all I am saying, that you should not have to." She looked at him, and her eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, but with the particular brightness of someone who has been holding something tightly and is considering the possibility of letting it be held differently. "I have thought about you too," she said. "In that way." She said it plainly, in the manner she did everything, without adornment or apology. "I have tried not to because it seemed impractical." He almost smiled. "Impractical." "I am a very practical woman." "You are," he agreed. "It is one of the things I admire most about you." She looked at her hands around the mug. "I do not want to need you," she said. "I mean that in the best possible way. I do not want to need you the way someone needs a solution. I think I would like," she paused, searching for words that were not her usual direct vocabulary. "I would like if we came to each other as equals, choosing each other, not because of necessity." "That is exactly how I would want it," he said. "There is no necessity in this for me. I could find work elsewhere. I stay because I want to stay, because of you, and the land, which is extraordinary. But mostly because of you." She looked at him, and the brightness in her eyes settled into something warmer and steadier, and she said, "Robert Redmond, you are a very surprising man." "You are a very extraordinary woman," he said. They sat for a while longer in the kitchen, and then she said she ought to get some sleep before the morning chores, and he agreed. At the door, she paused with her hand on the frame and turned back and said, "Come to supper Sunday," not as the hired hand. "Just come to supper." "I will," he said. She went in. He walked through the mist to the bunkhouse and lay awake with a feeling in his chest like spring, like that moment when everything that was closed begins to open. Sunday supper was different from every other meal they had shared, and they both knew it, and neither of them made it strange by pointing at it. She had made roast chicken and fresh bread, and there were flowers on the table, wildflowers, the first ones of spring, set in a crockery jar with the practical simplicity that was entirely her. He had cleaned up with extra care, and his hair was combed, and he brought her a small paper bag of peppermint candies from Colby, because he had noticed she kept a single peppermint candy from a jar on the store counter every time they visited, and ate it slowly on the ride home, and the expression on her face when he produced the bag was worth every mile of the ride. They talked differently at that dinner. Not about cattle or fences or accounts. though those things were still real and would always be the foundation of life here, but about bigger things, deeper things, about what they believed, about what they hoped for, about what they thought a good life looked like. He told her that he had spent his adult years moving from place to place, and that somewhere in the past year, he had begun to understand that what he had actually been looking for was not a better job but a place to truly belong, and that belonging felt, to him, as much about a person as about a piece of land. She was quiet for a moment after that, and then she said, "I have been afraid of needing anyone again. After Thomas. Not because he was unkind, he was the gentlest man, but because losing someone you need is so." She stopped. "And then you arrived and you were so, you did not try to take anything over. You just stood beside me. And I found that so much harder to resist than I expected." "Good," he said softly. "I told myself I could handle the ranch alone," she said. "You can," he said. "I have never doubted that." "I know," she said. But and here she stopped and looked at him across the table with those direct dark eyes and a vulnerability that was hard-won and precious. "But I find I do not want to particularly." "You should not have to," he said. "You absolutely should not have to." She reached across the table and put her hand in his, palm to palm, and his fingers closed around hers. And they sat like that for a long moment, with the evening light slanting through the window and the spring air coming through the cracked door, and the plains spreading out in every direction around the small house that was her home, that was beginning in his heart to feel like home to him too. Harlan Voss came back in May, as Robert had predicted he would. This time he came with a document, a paper from a county court, that he presented to Mary with the air of a man playing a card he was confident would take the trick. The document was a notice of disputed boundary, claiming that a surveying error placed the western 20 acres of the Merritt Ranch within a parcel that Voss's investment group had a historical claim to. Mary read the document without any change of expression. Then she folded it carefully and said, "I will need to consult with a lawyer." "Of course," Voss said, smiling. "I would encourage speed, however. These legal matters can become expensive." After Voss left, Mary spread the document on the kitchen table and she and Robert read it together, and Robert looked at the survey references and said there was something wrong with the numbers. The survey coordinates cited in the document did not match any survey markers he had seen along the western fence line. "We need a surveyor," he said. "Can we get one in time?" "I will ride to Hays tomorrow," he said. Hays City was the nearest town of significant size. "There is a federal land office there. They will have proper survey records." She put her hand on the document. "This is manufactured," she said. Her voice was even, but underneath it was a controlled fury that he found, if he were being entirely honest, magnificent. "He has manufactured a legal dispute to pressure me." "Yes," Robert said, "but manufactured things can be disproved. Let me go to Hays." He rode to Hays the next morning before dawn and arrived in the early afternoon, and spent 4 hours in the federal land office going through survey records with a methodical patience that the land office clerk found unusual in a cowboy and said so. And Robert said he had a good reason, and found what he was looking for. The original survey of the Merritt property from 1871, signed and sealed, with coordinates that contradicted the Voss document at every significant point. He also found, in the records of the county courthouse in Hays, evidence that Voss had used an identical tactic on 3 other properties in 2 counties, 2 of which had resulted in sales under duress when the owners could not afford legal defense. He took careful handwritten notes of everything, bought coffee, and rode back to the ranch in the evening light, arriving after dark. Mary was on the porch when he came up the road, and she came down the steps when she saw him, and he could tell she had been anxious all day by the way she moved quickly, with relief. "What did you find?" she asked. He dismounted and pulled his notes from his coat. "Everything we need," he said. They sat up until midnight going through the documents. In the morning she rode with him to Colby, where they met with the county's only lawyer, a thin, careful man named Hector Baines, who reviewed what Robert had gathered, and said it was more than sufficient to dismiss the Voss claim and potentially expose Voss to a fraud action. Baines filed the necessary responses with the court, and 3 weeks later, a county judge reviewed the case and found in favor of Mary Merritt. The western boundary of the ranch was exactly where the original survey said it was. Harlan Voss was ordered to cease all claims and was under investigation for fraudulent legal filings. When the ruling came, Mary read the letter from Baines twice and then put it down on the kitchen table and sat very still for a moment and then said, "Well," in a voice that carried 6 months of tension releasing all at once. Robert was across the table watching her. She looked up at him. "You rode to Hayes," she said. "It needed doing. You spent 2 days going through records at a federal land office for my ranch," she said. "For you," he said simply, "not just the ranch." She stood up from the table and he stood too, and she crossed to him and without any hesitation or preliminary she put both her hands on either side of his face and kissed him, and it was decisive and real and entirely characteristic of her, and when she stepped back her eyes were bright and certain. "I would like you to stay," she said, "not as the hired hand, permanently, if that is something you want." He looked at her. His heart was doing something considerable in his chest. "That is exactly what I want," he said. He kissed her back, taking her hands from his face and holding them between his, and then pressing his lips to her forehead and pulling her close, and she went willingly, which was the most important thing she had ever done willingly, because Mary Merritt did not do anything without intention. They stood in the kitchen of the Merritt ranch in the warm May afternoon, with the windows open, and the smell of spring grass coming through, and the sound of the cattle somewhere across the pasture, and held each other in the particular way of 2 people who have been very careful for a long time, and are now allowing themselves something true. Summer on the ranch was the best of Robert's life, and he was a man who had seen considerable country and had some good summers in it. The work was full and satisfying, the cattle were thriving, and the calves from the spring were growing strong. He and Mary worked together with the ease of long practice, but there was something new in it now, the ease of people who had chosen each other, not just people who were efficient together. They rode the property lines together in the long evenings, when the work was done and the light went gold and red across the flat land, and he was deeply happy in those rides, the kind of happiness that does not announce itself loudly but sits quietly in your chest and makes everything brighter. He proposed to her in August, which was not a planned or ceremonial thing but arrived naturally, as most true things did between them. They were sitting on the porch in the evening and she was mending a piece of harness, and he was reading a week-old copy of the Kansas newspaper, and he put the paper down and looked at her and said, "Mary, I would like to marry you, if you will have me." She looked up from the harness. She looked at him for a moment with that direct, assessing look. "Are you certain?" she said. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," he said. "Then yes," she said. "I will have you, Robert Redmond." He took her hand and kissed it, and she said he did not have to be fancy about it, and he said he was not being fancy. He was being sincere, and she said those could coexist, and he said she was right, and she smiled the full smile that she gave rarely, and that was worth waiting for. They were married in October, 1 year almost to the week after Robert had stepped off a train in Colby with no plans and fixed a wagon wheel for a determined woman he had not yet met. The ceremony was at the small church in Colby, performed by the minister there, with Elias Bunt and his wife as witnesses and Pete Garfield, who had come through Kansas again and been invited on the strength of good timing, in attendance. Hector Baines came, because he had grown genuinely fond of Mary during the legal proceedings. Sheriff Alderman came, because he was a decent man and liked to celebrate decent outcomes. Mary wore the best dress she owned, which was dark blue wool, not a wedding dress in the traditional sense, but a dress that suited her exactly, practical and dignified and quietly beautiful. She had put her hair up and worn the pearl earrings that had been her mother's, and when Robert saw her come through the church door, he thought that he had seen beautiful landscapes in his years of Western travel, enormous and breathtaking things, and none of them had prepared him for the particular way she looked walking toward him with her chin up and her eyes steady, and a smile that was just for him. He had cleaned up with extreme thoroughness. Pete Garfield had told him he looked almost civilized, which Robert took as a genuine compliment from Pete. The minister performed the ceremony with warmth and brevity, which was exactly what Mary and Robert both wanted. When it came to the vows, Mary said hers with the directness that was her nature: I will, and I do, and I shall, each word meaning exactly what it said. Robert said his looking at her face the entire time because there was nothing else worth looking at. At the end, when the minister pronounced them married and Robert took her face in both hands and kissed her, there was a brief round of applause from the small assembled group, and Elias Bunt's wife made a sound of satisfaction that carried across the small church. They drove back to the ranch in the afternoon, just the two of them, the plains enormous and quiet around them, and she put her hand in his on the wagon seat and kept it there the whole way home. The autumn cattle sale was the best the Merritt ranch had seen in several years. They drove 30 head to Wichita in September before the wedding, and the prices were strong. With Robert's experience managing large cattle operations, they had made several adjustments to the herd management over the summer that had improved the condition of the animals notably. The buyer's agent at Wichita had commented on it, and the price per head reflected that. Standing with Mary outside the sale pen watching the buyer count the cattle, Robert had done the mental arithmetic of what the sale would mean for the ranch's accounts, and the number was genuinely good. He told her the rough figure, and she looked at it for a moment and then looked at the herd and said, "We should expand to 65 head next spring, possibly 70. 70 would be ambitious," he said. "I have been called ambitious before," she said. "It is one of the things I love about you," he said, and she looked at him sideways, and the autumn light caught the fine lines around her eyes that were the marks of a life lived outdoors, and he loved those too. After the wedding, the ranch bore both their names in the way that two people make a home together, not by one overriding the other, but by becoming something new that contains both. Robert brought his capabilities and his experience and his steadiness. Mary brought everything she had always been: the 40 acres and the cattle and the deep knowledge of the land, and the precision of her thinking and the strength of her will. Together they were simply better than either of them alone, not because either was lacking, but because the best things multiply when they are combined with other good things. They added a hand in November, a young man named Samuel Torres, 20 years old, the son of a Mexican family that had been working land in the county for 2 generations. Samuel was hardworking and honest and skilled with horses in a way that was immediately obvious, and Robert hired him on the merit of what he saw and paid him a fair wage without discussion, and Mary approved the hire with complete equanimity and treated Samuel with the same direct, respectful practicality she applied to everyone. Samuel proved himself within 3 weeks by essentially solving a recurring problem with the South Pasture water system that had been causing intermittent issues for 2 years, through a combination of observation and practical ingenuity that impressed Robert genuinely. Robert told him so, and Samuel, who seemed to have expected something other than direct acknowledgement, received it with a surprise that told its own story about the kinds of workplaces he had experienced before. "You will find this is a place where good work is recognized," Robert told him, "and where you are valued for what you contribute." Samuel became a reliable and integral part of the operation, and in time a genuine friend, which was its own form of riches on the high plains where community was precious. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was cold but manageable, and Mary and Robert settled into the rhythms of married life with the same practical grace that had always characterized their relationship. They argued sometimes. She was not a woman who softened her opinions for domestic peace, and he was not a man who backed down from his when he had good reason to hold them. But they argued honestly and listened to each other and resolved things through reason rather than volume, which was perhaps the most functional aspect of two very capable people building a life together. He had moved into the main house, of course, which meant the bunkhouse became Samuel's domain, and the house, which had been built for two people and then been a house for one, became full again in the best way. He added a shelf for books in the front room because he had begun acquiring books wherever he found them, a habit he had not had the settled life to practice before. She added a second chair to the porch because the one chair had always been slightly lonely. In January, she told him she thought she might be expecting a child. She said it on a Sunday morning, sitting across the breakfast table, with the particular measured calm of a woman who had thought about how to say something carefully and had chosen directness over softening. He looked at her. His expression did something she would describe later to Elias Bunt's wife as entirely overwhelming to witness surprise and joy and something very deep and careful all at once. "Are you well?" he said first, because that was the most important question. "I feel quite well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but well." He got up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down beside her chair and took her hands in his, looking up at her face. "Mary," he said. "I know," she said. She was smiling, that full and rare smile. "I know, Robert." He pressed his forehead to her hands for a moment. She put one hand on the back of his neck with great tenderness. They told Samuel, who produced a wide and genuine grin, and said he was very happy for them, and then immediately became extremely solicitous about which of the heavier ranch tasks he could take over to reduce Mary's load, which she accepted with somewhat more grace than she accepted most offers of help, because Samuel was so enthusiastic about it that refusing would have felt unkind. Robert was attentive without being smothering, which was the exact calibration that Mary required. He made sure she ate well and rested when she should and did not climb anything precarious, all of which he enforced not through restriction, but through the steady presence of a man who would quietly move the ladder to the hayloft to a place she would have to ask him to retrieve it from, which she did not find out about for 2 weeks and then found mildly outrageous, and then, after a moment's reflection, found rather touching. The pregnancy progressed through the spring of 1884 with good health and the particular vitality that comes to some women in that state. Mary became, if possible, even more energetically present in the ranch operations, directing and planning from the porch when Robert and Samuel were managing the physical work, her mind as precise and efficient as ever. They had long conversations in the evenings about the child, about names, about the kind of people they hoped to raise. Mary said she wanted a child who was taught from the beginning that capable people came in every kind, and Robert said he wanted a child who knew that asking for help was not weakness but intelligence, and they agreed that these were not separate values and could be taught together. The baby was born in September of 1884, delivered by the midwife from Colby, a capable woman named Mrs. Holt, who had delivered more than 200 children in her career, and whose manner was efficiently reassuring. Robert sat outside the closed door of the bedroom for 6 hours in a state of controlled anxiety, and Samuel sat with him for much of it because he could not think of anything else to do. And when Mrs. Holt opened the door and said, "You have a son, Mr. Redmond, and your wife is quite well," Robert stood up and had to put his hand on the wall for a moment. He went in. Mary was propped against the pillows with the slightly demolished look of someone who had accomplished something very difficult and knows it completely. In her arms was a bundle that was his son, which was the most extraordinary thing Robert had ever encountered, and he had encountered some extraordinary things in 34 years. He sat on the edge of the bed and she put the child in his arms, and he held his son with the careful reverence of a man who has been trusted with something beyond value, and the baby had dark hair and enormous eyes and the particular expression of the very newly born, which is one of universal bewilderment, and Robert thought he was the most remarkable person he had ever met. "He looks like you," Mary said. "He is far better looking than me," Robert said. She laughed, which was excellent to hear, because it meant she was all right. They named him James Thomas Redmond. James for Robert's grandfather, who had been a good man on the Missouri land before the bank took it, and Thomas for the man who had built this ranch and loved Mary first, and whose memory deserved to be carried forward with honesty and love rather than buried under discomfort. James Thomas Redmond grew his first year with great enthusiasm and considerable noise, and a personality that revealed itself early as a combination of Mary's determination and Robert's patience, which was a theoretically contradictory combination that worked beautifully in practice. He loved the horses with a passion that was evident from the first time Robert held him near me, who bent her large head down to sniff the baby with tremendous delicacy, and James Thomas grabbed a handful of me's forelock and would not let go, which Robert took as a professional endorsement. Samuel became, over the first year of the baby's life, something close to a member of the extended family, part of the daily life of the ranch in a way that went beyond employment. He and Robert had developed the easy camaraderie of men who work well together and like each other honestly, and Mary trusted his judgment as thoroughly as she trusted anything, which was high praise from a woman who trusted carefully. The ranch expanded, as Mary had planned. They went to 70 head in the spring of 1885, and the operation was running well enough by then that they could consider improvements that had been theoretical for years. Robert rebuilt the barn that winter, making it larger and better insulated, with Samuel's help and the occasional assistance of neighbors who came to help in the traditional way of the Plains community showing up when community was needed, fed at the Redmond table afterward. The western Kansas plains were changing around them in those years. The railroad expansion was bringing more settlers, more towns, more of the complicated changes that came with settlement pressing further into territory that had belonged, in recent memory and in living truth, to peoples who had been there long before any homestead was filed. Robert and Mary were aware of this history in the way that thoughtful people of their time were aware, not always with the full understanding that later generations would develop, but with a recognition that the land they stood on carried more history than the deed in the strongbox acknowledged, and that the treatment of the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples who had lived on these plains was something that sat uncomfortably when examined honestly. They had encountered this directly once in the early years, when a Cheyenne man had come to the southern fence line on a cold November day, an older man, dignified and direct, whose name Robert never learned because the language barrier was complete, and neither of them had any of the other's words. The man had needed water, clearly, and his horse was in poor condition, and Mary had brought water and what food she could quickly assemble without any discussion of it being a question, because need was need, and that was how she understood the world. The man had drunk and given some to his horse and looked at her with eyes that contained a great deal and then ridden south, and they had watched him go and stood with the weight of a much larger story than they could fully hold. Robert had said afterward, "There should be something to say about all of it. I cannot find the words." "Neither can I," Mary said, "but doing what we can when someone is in front of us is not nothing." "It is not enough," he said. "No," she agreed. "It is not." These were not easy things to sit with, and they sat with them the way honest people sit with hard truths, imperfectly, with the acknowledgement that imperfect sitting is better than looking away. By the spring of 1886, the Merritt Redmond Ranch Mary had kept Merritt in the operational name, because Thomas had built it, and that deserved permanence was one of the more successful small operations in the county. Not wealthy by the standards of the large land barons, but genuinely prosperous, which was different and more meaningful on the plains. The cattle herd was strong and well managed. The land was in good condition, the water system reliable. Samuel had been given a formal raise and additional responsibilities that reflected his actual role in the operation, which was something between a senior ranch hand and a junior partner, and Robert had begun speaking with him about the possibility of eventually acquiring land of his own if he chose. James Thomas, now 18 months old, was conducting his life with magnificent energy. He had learned to walk with a determination that was entirely his mother's and a gait that was entirely his own, and he spent considerable time following Robert around the yard with the focused intensity of someone acquiring all possible information about the world. Robert found this deeply wonderful and accommodated it completely, narrating what he was doing as he did it, and answering the questions that came in whatever language James Thomas currently had available, which was mostly enthusiastic noise but communicative noise. Mary watched this from the porch sometimes, her husband and her son, the afternoon light on both of them, the Kansas plain stretching out in every direction, and felt a fullness that she did not have words for and did not need words for. She had been a woman who believed in capability and independence and the power of her own will, and she had been right to believe in all of those things. They had carried her through great difficulty. But there was something else true too, something she had resisted for a long time, that choosing to share your life with someone who was worthy of it was not a weakening of self but an expansion of it. That a strong person becoming part of something larger did not become less strong. They became something new. She had told him she could handle the ranch alone. He had said he knew. He had said she should not have to. And both things had been exactly right, each in its own way, and the combination of both truths was what had made everything possible. She had thought about that conversation many times in the years since, on the cold morning at the kitchen table when the spring was breaking open outside and he had looked at her with those river-colored eyes and said, with such simple certainty, that she should not have to. Not that she could not that she needed rescuing. Simply that no person, alone with their capability and their grief and their 40 acres, should have to carry everything without a hand beside them. She was not alone. She was, in every meaningful way, more herself than she had ever been, because she was herself in full now, with room to be so. That fall, they had the best cattle sale yet, and Robert came back from Wichita with the figures written carefully in a small notebook, and sat across the kitchen table from her, and pushed the notebook toward her, and she read the number and looked up at him and said, "Robert." "I know," he said, grinning, which was a thing he did not do enough of and which she loved completely when it happened. "We could buy the Lassiter property," she said, because her mind had already jumped to the next possibility, the way her mind always did. The Lassiter land, that old abandoned acreage to the west where the fire had started 4 years ago, had been up for legitimate sale through the county for 2 years. It would double their western boundary. "We could," he said. "It needs significant work. It has water rights along the western draw," she said. "I know," he said. "I have looked at it." "You have looked at it," she repeated. "I wondered if you might want to expand that direction," he said. "So I rode out there last month and walked the property." She looked at him with the expression she sometimes had when he did something that was very specifically attuned to her, a look of recognition and warmth and something close to wonder. "You rode out there last month," she said. "You mentioned the Lassiter property in passing in August and then did not mention it again," he said, "which is usually when you are thinking about something most seriously." She shook her head slowly. "You know me very well," she said. "I have paid close attention," he said. She laughed. "We should ride out there together," she said, "this week." "I thought you might say that," he said. "I told Samuel we might need him to manage the morning chores Thursday." She reached across the table and put her hand on his, which was the particular gesture she had made many times now and which still carried the same warmth for both of them that it had the first time. "You anticipated me," she said. "You are not always difficult to anticipate," he said. "When something is the right move, you see it clearly. I have learned to look in the same direction." They rode out to the Lassiter property on Thursday, with James Thomas bundled against Mary's chest in the carrier she had fashioned from canvas and leather, because he was not yet 2, and the weather was cool, and she was not leaving him with anyone when she could take him along. He observed the entire expedition with great interest and eventually fell asleep against her chest, which freed up her hands to hold the property survey she had brought from the land office. The Lassiter land was in rough condition from years of abandonment overgrown, fences long since tumbled, the old soddy collapsed into itself, but the bones of it were good. The soil was sound. The western draw that carried water rights was clear and running. The land sloped gently in a way that would allow natural pasture management. Robert watched Mary walk the southern edge of it with the survey in her hand and James Thomas asleep against her chest, reading the land with the knowledge of a woman who had spent 15 years understanding what this particular piece of earth required. And he thought that the view of her against the wide Kansas sky with their sleeping sun, and her maps, and her complete, focused intelligence was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. More beautiful than any landscape he could name. She turned back to him with her conclusion already arrived at. "We should make an offer," she said. "I agree," he said. They bought the Lassiter property the following month. The negotiation was brief because the county land office simply wanted it off their records, and the price was fair. Robert and Samuel began clearing and fencing the new acreage before winter set in, and Mary managed the planning with the satisfaction of someone adding a new room to a house they have always loved. Christmas of 1886 was the best the Redmond household had seen, which was saying something because the previous two had been genuinely good. James Thomas was old enough to have opinions about the season, which he expressed with comprehensive enthusiasm. Mary's sister, Eleanor, came from Ohio, the first of her family to visit since Mary's move west 13 years ago. And the visit was everything complicated and good that family reunions tend to be, because Eleanor was a woman with different values and different understanding of the world, and the life Mary had built was not what Eleanor had imagined for her little sister. But she could not look at the ranch and the man and the child and the evident, unqualified completeness of Mary's life and argue with any of it. Robert was precisely as he was with everyone, calm, direct, without pretension or performance. Eleanor told Mary privately on her second evening that she had not been sure what to expect, and that Robert was not what she had expected, and that she meant that as the highest compliment, and Mary said she knew. And Eleanor said he looked at Mary like she was the best thing he had ever seen, and Mary said yes, she knew that too, and did not try to hide how much she loved that this was so. On New Year's Eve they sat on the porch, which was cold enough to require heavy coats and the throw blanket from the front room, with Eleanor already gone back east and James Thomas asleep inside and Samuel at the Bunt farm for the holiday. The plains were very quiet under a sky full of stars that the clean cold air made sharp and close. 14 years you have been on this land," Robert said. 15 nearly, she said. "I arrived in March of 1873. Did you know that first March what it would become?" She thought about it. "I knew I loved it," she said. "I knew it would be difficult. I knew I could manage it." She paused. "I did not know you were coming." "No," he said. "I did not know I was coming here either." "What did you think you were going to when you got on that train in Colorado?" "A job," he said. "Just another position." He looked out at the stars. "I could not have imagined this." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was a thing she did comfortably now, the ease of 2 years of marriage having settled into her bones. He put his arm around her and they sat in the star-cold silence. "I am glad you stayed," she said. "I am glad every day that you stayed." "There was never any real question," he said. "The moment I understood what was happening, there was never any question." "The moment in the barn," she said, "with Mabel and the calf." "Earlier than that," he said. "The porch in November with the coffee." She was quiet for a moment. "The journal at Christmas," she said. "Earlier than that too," he said. "But yes." She lifted her head and looked at him. In the starlight his face was very clear, the lines of a man who had lived outdoors and laughed when he had something to laugh about and been serious when seriousness was required. And she loved his face with the particular love that comes from having watched someone be entirely and consistently themselves across years of real life. "Robert Redmond," she said. "Mary Redmond," he said back, and she smiled at the name because she loved it, not because she had surrendered anything to it, but because it contained both of them, and because he said it the way he said everything that was true, with complete sincerity and no decoration. She kissed him in the cold Kansas night, and he held her close in the large warmth of his coat, and the stars kept their enormous patient course overhead. The new year came in quietly. January 1887 brought cold that was serious but not dangerous, and the ranch operations continued with the steady competence of a well-managed household. In February, Mary told him she was expecting again, and this time he was prepared for the announcement in the way that people are prepared the second time around, still moved, deeply moved, but with fewer walls to knock down before arriving at the feeling. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Well," she said, "tired as before. Hungry for things that are strange." "What things?" "Pickles," she said, "and cornbread together." "I will make sure we have both," he said. She gave birth in September of 1887 as reliably as a calendar. Mrs. Holt came again and Robert sat outside the door again, though this time Samuel had ridden to the Bunt farm to give Mary's privacy its due and give Robert the space to be anxious without an audience. The second child was a girl. Mary named her Clara Ruth Redmond, and Clara arrived in the world with a composure that was immediately apparent. A baby who looked around the room with the alert, observant quality of someone cataloging information, and who did not cry for long before deciding she had expressed her opinion adequately. James Thomas, at age 3, was introduced to his sister with all the gravity the occasion deserved, and he stood beside the bed and looked at her for a long moment, and then patted the blanket next to her hand, with the concentrated tenderness of a small child performing a very careful action. Robert, watching from the doorway, found it necessary to look at the ceiling for a moment. The family of 4 filled the ranch house with a life that was full and specific and daily. Robert and Mary built a life that did not look like idleness or ease. They worked hard, every season, and the plains were not gentle and the work was never done, but that was good in the deepest way. The way that comes from purpose pursued alongside people you love in a place that is entirely and truly home. James Thomas grew into a boy who followed Robert everywhere with a devotion that Robert received with the particular moved steadiness of a man who had not expected fatherhood, and found it to be among the defining experiences of his life. He taught the boy to ride properly, at 4 sitting behind him on me with his arms around him, and letting him hold the reins, narrating what the horse communicated with her body and how to listen to that communication. James Thomas was a natural, as Robert had suspected he would be, with Mary's instinct for things and his grandfather's feel for the land. Clara, as she grew, revealed herself to be the child most like her mother, methodical, direct, possessed of opinions she expressed without apology and capable of a silence that contained considerable thought. She watched the ranch operations with the same focused interest that Mary had brought to everything since she was a young woman in Ohio, and at age 4 she was already asking questions about the cattle that were more specific than many adults managed. Mary watched both her children and felt the particular satisfaction of seeing people develop into themselves. She had wanted children who understood that capability and help were not opposites, and they were learning that, from the example of 2 people who had built their life on exactly that understanding. Elias Bunt died in the spring of 1889, at a venerable age, and left the Bunt farm to his wife and children, and his wife Margaret came to sit on the Redmond porch some afternoons and drink coffee with Mary. And there was a comfort in that companionship that Mary valued quietly and deeply. The particular comfort of older women who had both been in difficult places and come through them, who understood each other without extensive explanation. Samuel Torres married in 1889, a young woman named Lucia from a family in the South County, and the wedding was celebrated at the Redmond Ranch with considerable food and happiness, and James, Thomas, and Clara, who were 5 and 2, in attendance and extremely interested in all of it. Samuel and Lucia eventually acquired a small property of their own 4 miles east, and the working relationship between the two ranches became a practical alliance as well as a friendship. By 1890, western Kansas was changing considerably. The cattle trade had evolved, the railroad had extended further, towns had grown. The broad open range of the early years was giving way to more fenced and settled landscape. Some things were lost in this. Robert sometimes felt the particular loss of open horizon that had been the defining feature of the cowboy life he had known. But most things were simply different, and the Redmond Ranch adapted to difference as it had always adapted to everything, through intelligent attention and practical response. The ranch was prosperous, not large by the standards of the great cattle operations to the south, but solid and well-managed and genuinely their own. Robert did the accounts now with the same precision Mary had brought to them, and she checked his figures sometimes not because she doubted him, but because she liked to know every number, and he handed over the ledger without comment because he understood that perfectly. One evening in the autumn of 1890, they were sitting on the porch in the particular gold of a Kansas October sunset, James Thomas doing his homework at the table inside. He attended the school in Colby now, 3 days a week, and was reportedly the best reader in his class, which Mary accepted as straightforward fact and Robert received with a pride he tried not to make ridiculous, and Clara asleep. Having collapsed mid-afternoon with the comprehensive unconsciousness of a 3-year-old who has used up all available energy, Robert said, out of the quietness, "Do you remember the first thing you said to me?" "You said you could help with the axle pin," she said. "I said you had better get down here," he laughed. "You said to get down here." "I needed an extra pair of hands," she said, "not a conversation." "No," he agreed. "You needed hands, not conversation. That was the first thing I understood about you." What was the second? He thought about it. That you were someone who paid close attention to things. You had already understood the problem with the axle. You just needed the help, not the diagnosis. "And the third," he looked at her. "That I wanted very much to be useful to you," he said. "That was the third thing." She looked back at him, and in the long golden light of the October evening, she was the woman he had met at a wagon wheel in a Kansas street 8 years ago, and the woman who had sat across a kitchen table in crisis and grief, and counted her numbers with careful precision, and the woman who had put her hands on his face and kissed him with complete conviction, and the woman who had pushed him the ledger, and said, "We should buy the Lassiter property," with the same tone she used for everything certain. And she was the mother of his children and the manager of this ranch, and the keeper of the accounts and the person he turned to first for every important thought. And she was Mary, just Mary, and that was everything. "You are useful to me," she said. "You are the most useful thing in my life." "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "I have said more romantic things." "You have said deeply romantic things," he agreed. "But coming from you, useful is the highest possible category." She laughed, and he loved it, the way he always had. And she leaned over and kissed him on the cheek, and he turned his head and kissed her properly, and the sun went further down behind the plains, and the sky turned every color it knew how to be. Inside, James Thomas came to the porch door and said, "I finished the sums," and his mother said, "Bring them here," and his father said, "Come sit." And the boy came out to the porch with his paper and sat on the step below them, and the evening held all 4 of them together in its long and golden light, and the land stretched out to the horizon in every direction, 40 acres that had grown to 80, and everything they had built between them on it, and the future already taking its first steps on the porch in front of them. The Mary Redmond Ranch stood for many more years on the western Kansas plains, through seasons of drought and seasons of plenty, through all the changes that came with a new century approaching, through the growth of the children and the deepening of the years. Robert Redmond never rode on, never looked for the next position, because the thing he had spent his wandering life moving toward had been a wagon wheel on a dusty street, and the woman standing next to it, who had told him to get down here, who had needed hands and not diagnosis, who had built 40 acres into something real and good, and who had been exactly right that she could handle it alone, and who had been invited, eventually, to let that not be necessary, and who had said yes to that invitation with the full force of her considerable self. Mary Merritt, who became Mary Redmond and kept both names in different ways because she had earned them both, lived on the land she had loved since her first Kansas morning with a fullness that she had not known was possible, and had not asked for, and had been given anyway, by a man who knew what she was worth and never tried to diminish it by a single degree, who had walked toward her with a perfectly calibrated offer of precisely the help she needed in precisely the form she could receive it, and who had said, with the certainty of something already decided, "I know you can handle it, but you should not have to." She had told him she could handle the ranch alone. He had said he knew. He had said she should not have to. They had been both of them entirely, permanently, beautifully right.